My name is Sam Reed, and at 31, I never thought a family dinner could become the fine line between survival and losing everything. Sitting across from me was my younger sister, Chloe, her lips curved into a delicate smile that carried nothing but mockery. My mother, Linda, sat with her arms crossed, her cold gaze sweeping over me. My father, Martin, stayed silent, but his eyes hung over me like a suspended sentence. Between us, a glass of deep red cranberry juice sat still on the table, condensation slowly trailing down its side as if counting down to something I had yet to discover. The phone in my pocket buzzed. On the screen, Lucas Bennett, Chloe's ex-boyfriend. A short message, "Don't drink. They have a plan." 6 words, and every sense in me instantly blared with alarm. Before I reveal what really happened after that cranberry juice, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit the like button if you've ever felt like your own family was hiding a secret behind a seemingly harmless smile. If there's one thing I've learned after more than 30 years in this family, it's that affection here always comes with conditions. And that condition almost always has the name Chloe Reed. I'm Sam Reed, 31 years old, a cybersecurity specialist in Portland. A career I'm proud of because I built it entirely on my own, without relying on anyone. I live in a small downtown apartment, quiet enough to focus, warm enough to call home. As for my parents' house, the place where I grew up, it hasn't felt like home in a long time. My father, Martin, is the kind of man who believes daughters are born to be protected, but in his mind, protection means control and restriction. My mother, Linda, lives in her own world, where everything revolves around the image of a perfect family she's built, regardless of the cracks running through it. And Chloe, my younger sister, has never had to worry about a thing. If Chloe overspends, the family finds a way to cover it. If Chloe messes up, someone else bears the consequences. And that someone else is usually me. That evening, I got a text from my mother. "Come home for dinner." Important. I could almost guess what it would be about, but I went anyway. Walking into the dining room, the air was so thick you could cut it. Dad sat at the head of the table, Mom to his right, and Chloe, in a brand new designer dress, was fussing with her nails like the rest of the world didn't exist. There was no small talk. My dad got straight to the point. "Chloe's in a bit of trouble. She needs you to help her with $15,000. I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of trouble?" My mom answered for him, her tone light, almost casual. "Just some gambling issues." You know she didn't mean it. I looked straight into their eyes. Not meaning it doesn't erase the debt. And it's not my responsibility. The atmosphere shifted instantly. My father's brows knitted, his voice dropping. "You sound cold. Family is supposed to help each other. Or have you forgotten who raised you?" My mother folded her arms, her gaze colder than her voice. "I'm disappointed in you, Sam. You really are cold-blooded." Chloe gave a low, mocking laugh without looking up. "You've always thought you were better than everyone else." Those words didn't cut because I hadn't heard them before, they cut because they were so familiar. Familiar enough that I could almost see myself again at 16, standing in the corner, listening to the adults make every decision for me. I took a deep breath, setting my glass of water back on the table. The dark red liquid trembled slightly, the light above glinting off its surface, a motif I didn't know would return more than once. The love in this house was never meant for me. Without waiting for a reaction, I stood up. The screech of the chair legs against the wood floor was sharp and jarring. I walked out of that room, leaving behind Chloe's disdainful smirk, my mother's long, drawn-out sigh, and my father's gaze hanging over me like a suspended sentence. Driving home, my hands still gripped the steering wheel as tightly as they had gripped that glass. Part of me wanted to believe this was just another one of their attempts to convince me. But another part had already begun to sense there was something more to this than just a debt. On the drive home, old memories of the times I sacrificed everything for them came flooding back, vivid as if they'd happened just yesterday. The Portland drizzle lingered as if someone were trying to wash away what was left of the day. Streetlights cast a golden haze over the patchy, rain-streaked pavement. I drove slower than usual, not because the road was slick, but because my mind was being pulled back to earlier years, to the time when I learned that in my family, kindness always came with a cost. I was 16. My hands back then were covered in tiny cracks from washing glasses in cold water at the cafe near my school. The hourly wage was barely enough to cover a few lunches, yet I carefully tucked every single tip into a cream-colored envelope. In my head, I counted every cent. Not to buy the new coat I'd been eyeing for a month, but to get Chloe the red dress hanging in the shop window on the corner, the one she'd stared at through the glass more times than I could count. I remember the day I gave her the gift box. Chloe let out a small squeal of delight, but before she could throw her arms around me, my mother spoke. Chloe always keeps her sister worried. She's so lucky. Her voice was gentle, but beneath it lay the familiar message. I was the background, and Chloe was the painting. Then came the year I was 18. Everything fell apart when my mother was hospitalized for a heart condition and my father had just lost his job. No one had to ask me for help. One look at the pile of medical bills on the table, and I knew what I had to do. By day, I went to school. At night, I worked at a bookstore, then came home to log in and do data entry for a small company. I handed over everything I earned to my mother. All she said was, "You should learn to be as gentle as Chloe, and less cold." I swallowed the words back and forced a smile. But it didn't stop there. Once, during my final year of college, Chloe called me in tears because she'd wrecked her car. I checked my account and saw I had just enough to cover half the repair bill. The rest I pulled from the savings I'd set aside for next semester's tuition. When I brought her the money, Chloe barely glanced at it before turning the whole accident into a funny story for her friends. In her version, I wasn't the one who came through, I was just the uptight sister with money. Another memory I can't erase, Chloe's 21st birthday. My parents threw a huge party at the house, packed with friends and neighbors. I baked the cake, decorated, handled the music, even paid part of the live band's fee because Mom didn't want to shoulder it all. When the toasts came, my mother wrapped her arms around Chloe and said, "You are the best thing this family has ever had." I stood off to the side, camera in hand, wearing a smile I had to hold in place. Those fragments lined up like a slow-motion reel, repeating so many times that I couldn't tell when I'd grown used to enduring it. As I turned down the street toward my apartment, my bag on the passenger seat jostled with every pothole. I knew what was still inside, a thing that symbolized every tie I hadn't quite severed, my parents' house key. Cold, heavy, and every time my fingers brushed it, I felt the reminder that I was still trapped in the cycle of give, get dismissed, give again. I sat in my small living room, lights off, letting only the glow from the street lamps filter through the curtains. Silence wrapped around me. No comparisons, no orders, no family means, wielded like an invisible shackle. But the quiet came with an emptiness, too. I went to the closet and pulled out a large envelope. Inside, I placed the house key, along with the spare bank card my mother had given me at 20 in case of emergencies, a card I had almost never used, yet which was constantly brought up as proof I owed the family. I scribbled a short note on a small slip of paper. Blood ties aren't a blank check for every bill someone else racks up. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. The rain was still falling lightly, and the familiar road to the neighborhood where I'd grown up looked strangely foreign. I didn't ring the bell. I just set the envelope neatly on the wooden table on the porch. When the key hit the wood, it made a dry, sharp click, a sound that echoed in my head like a period at the end of a sentence. I turned and stepped down the porch stairs. I didn't look back. Behind that door was a lifetime of memories, good and bad, but today, I chose to walk away without carrying any of its weight. On the drive back, the radio played a familiar song. I couldn't make out the lyrics, only the blend of rain against the windshield and the steady beat of the wipers. And in that moment, I realized I was breathing easier. The emptiness might take time to fill, but at least I knew I had just reclaimed something, the right to choose who gets to enter my life. After that day, I thought everything had settled down and I could live as comfortably as I believed. But then, unexpectedly, an invitation I hadn't anticipated appeared on my phone screen: "Come home for dinner. I'm making your favorite dish." No exclamation mark, no emoji. Just a single, plain sentence. I stared at the words for a long moment. Less than a month ago, I had returned the house key and promised myself I would keep my distance. Now, this invitation felt as if nothing had ever happened. On the drive back, I passed through my old neighborhood. At the intersection near the house, a car window rolled down, and Mrs. Callahan's voice, the neighbor across the street, called out, "Sam? Back for a visit?" I smiled and nodded. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Your house feels different today." I raised an eyebrow but only replied politely, "Yeah, I guess so." The house came into view, lights glowing from the living room to the kitchen. The front door was ajar. The scent of rosemary and roasted chicken drifted out, reminding me of old family dinners, and yet, somehow, tonight that aroma made me feel just a little unsteady. My mother stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of soup, smiling and chatting with Chloe. She was wearing a deep blue silk dress, her curls styled to perfection. They both turned to greet me, but their eyes flickered past quickly, not exactly avoiding mine, just lacking the ease they used to have. "Is there something special going on?" I asked softly. Mom set the spoon down and wiped her hands on a towel. "No, just wanted the whole family together." When I turned to grab a glass of water, something caught my attention: Mom's bottle of sleeping pills sitting right there on the counter, next to the salt and pepper shakers. Normally, it was always tucked away in the cabinet. I found it a bit odd, but figured she must have used it the night before and simply hadn't put it back. Dinner began. The air felt slightly strained, as if everyone was trying to maintain a smooth, pleasant surface. Chloe talked about an upcoming trip, her voice even. Mom nodded along, adding a few lines about acquaintances asking about me. Everything flowed seamlessly, almost too seamlessly. I ladled some soup into my bowl. Steam rose, blurring Mom's face under the warm yellow light. In that moment, it felt like looking at a photograph with the important parts faintly obscured, without knowing exactly why. "Mom, Mrs. Callahan said our house seemed more lively than usual today?" I asked casually. Mom laughed. "She's always noticing everything." Chloe smiled, raising her wine glass. "She probably thinks you're the main character in some mystery movie." I laughed along, but that sense of different lingered, hazy, like a layer of fog that refused to lift. I couldn't tell if it came from Mom's gaze, the way Chloe toyed with her wine glass, or from me, the one trying to read between the lines. Dinner had already passed its halfway point. The clinking of knives and forks against plates, the steady ticking of the wall clock, and Chloe's laughter seemed to dance in the gaps between silences. I sat still, listening to it all like a familiar song that was somehow off-key. Then Dad walked in from the living room. He wore a charcoal V-neck sweater over a white button-down shirt, the top 2 buttons undone. The warm yellow light fell across his neatly combed salt and pepper hair. In his hands was a gleaming silver tray, and on it, 3 wide-rimmed glasses, each filled with a deep red liquid that shimmered under the light. He set each glass down on the table, his movements slow but deliberate. "Cranberry. Good for your health, warms the stomach." I lifted the glass in front of me slightly. The cold glass pressed against my skin, and through it, the liquid gleamed with that distinct ripe berry red, carrying a tart scent softened by a hint of sweetness. I had drunk this 100 times in my life, but tonight, it felt like it carried a different weight. I had just placed my fingers on the rim when my phone in my pocket buzzed. Once. Twice. By reflex, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Lucas, don't drink. They want to take your phone." I read slowly, as if to make sure I wasn't seeing things. My whole body slackened for half a second, then tightened instantly. A cold shiver ran down my spine, my heart skipping a beat. Lucas? Here? How could he know I was sitting in front of a glass of cranberry juice? "Aren't you going to drink?" My mother's voice floated over from the other side of the table, even as though she noticed nothing unusual. I looked up, my lips curving faintly. "I will, in a minute." The glass touched the table so softly it made no sound. My hand was still slightly trembling, and to hide it, I laced my fingers together and placed them on my lap. "I'm going to the restroom for a moment," I said, rising before anyone could object. My footsteps sounded clearly on the wooden floor. The bathroom door clicked shut behind me, a sound that seemed to cut me off from the outside world. I flipped on the light. White brightness bounced off the mirror. The scent of soap mixed with the damp smell of a towel that had hung too long. I drew in a deep breath, unlocked my phone, and tapped to call Lucas back. He picked up almost instantly. "Sam? You're there, aren't you?" His voice was low, urgent, with a faint hum of background noise. "What's going on?" "That text, what does it mean?" I asked, keeping my voice low but unable to hide the sharp edge of urgency. Lucas exhaled hard, as if he was trying to figure out how to say something he wasn't ready to. "I thought you knew. Last month, Chloe pulled me into covering one of her debts. She said it was just signing a few papers for a temporary loan, that she'd pay me back. But then, I overheard them talking, your mom, Chloe, and your dad." My hand gripped the edge of the sink, the cold, slick surface pressing into my palms. "Talking about what?" I forced my voice to stay level, even as a tightness began to coil in my chest. Lucas swallowed before answering. "They were planning to give you a mild dose of sleeping pills. And while you were out, they'd unlock your phone, access your company account, and transfer the money to another account. If you noticed, they'd say you pressed the wrong buttons yourself." A small snap went off in my head, like a string pulled too tight. I went silent. "Are you sure?" I asked again, my voice low and slow, as if each word had to pass through a thin layer of ice. "Sam, I heard every word. And this isn't just about money. They want you stripped of control. In their hands." The drip of the faucet became so clear I could almost count each drop. I lifted my head to look into the mirror. The glass reflected wide eyes, short, quick breaths. But deep in those eyes, in that moment, a different light sparked to life, sharp, focused. The shock ebbed, replaced by a clarity that felt almost dangerous. I released the edge of the sink, slowly smoothing the wrinkles on my shirt, then leaned slightly toward the mirror. "If they want it, let them try," I murmured, just loud enough for myself to hear. My hand touched the doorknob, then paused. I turned back one more time, meeting the reflection of a woman who, only minutes ago, would have kept avoiding and enduring, now standing straight, chin slightly raised. Chloe's laughter floated through the door, mingled with the sound of a spoon clinking against a bowl, steady and oddly fake. I drew in a deep breath, the scent of soap mixed with the faint trace of cranberry from the table still clinging to my collar. I opened the door. Stepped out. But not the way they expected. I walked back to the dining table, making sure my steps were neither too fast nor too slow. Everything was exactly where it had been: the deep red cranberry glass, the chill of the glass itself, the warm yellow light spilling onto the wooden tabletop, as if all of it was waiting for me to step into the play they had so carefully staged. But what they didn't know was that I had rewritten the script just minutes ago, right there in the bathroom. I pulled out my chair, sat down, my hand resting lightly on the rim of the glass. Through the glass, the liquid swayed, catching a thin, sharp ribbon of light. I brought the glass to my lips, letting my indifferent gaze sweep over each of them, my father watching me closely, my mother pretending to tidy the dishes, and Chloe trying to look busy on her phone. I tilted the glass so that the liquid barely touched my lips. That familiar sweet tart scent, but I didn't swallow. Instead, I let it pool in my mouth. Then, like any normal drinker, I tipped my head back, my throat making a faint motion, but the liquid never went down. As I set the glass back down, my left hand kept the rim shielded, while my right hand slipped under the table, tilting the glass to pour most of it into the potted plant right by my chair. The faint swish was swallowed up by the clinking of cutlery and the forced laughter. No one noticed. Chloe stayed absorbed in her phone, and my mother bent down for more bread, pretending not to pay attention. I took a tiny remaining sip to keep up the act, then slowly set the glass down. I think I'm a bit dizzy, I said, my voice soft and drawn out. My mother's head snapped up, her brows knitting together. What's wrong? I probably just need to lie down for a bit, I answered, eyes narrowing slightly, my hand pressing against my temple. My father stepped over quickly, placing his hand on my shoulder. Let me help you. As he guided me toward the sofa, each step on the wooden floor thudded evenly, punctuated by the ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound suddenly felt sharper, slower, as if I could count each beat. I collapsed onto the sofa, my head tilting to the side, eyes half shut. Through the narrow slit of my lashes, I saw the three of them exchange glances. My father glanced toward my handbag sitting on the side table. Chloe moved closer, her hand lightly tapping my shoulder, testing. Sis, are you asleep? Without waiting for an answer, she quickly grabbed my phone. Her fingers swiped across the screen, only to be met immediately by the first layer of security, a 6-digit passcode. I clearly heard her hiss. She always thinks she's smarter than everyone else. My mother stepped closer, whispering, "Try her fingerprint." Chloe pressed my finger to the sensor, but the screen still displayed that cold, unyielding line, 2-step authentication required. All three froze. In that moment, I felt a wave of heat rise from my chest to my neck, not fear, but the satisfaction of having full control. They had no idea I'd worked in tech security for almost 10 years. The 2-step lock on my phone wasn't just a passcode and fingerprint, it was programmed to send an alert to a hidden account if someone tried to break in more than 3 times. And more importantly, my phone's automatic recording mode had been switched on before I even left the table. Just minutes earlier in the bathroom, while calling Lucas, I had launched a background recording app, slipped the unlocked phone into my coat pocket, with the mic always facing outwards. Now, every whisper, every murmur of plotting, every faint sound, was being captured, down to the last second. If we can get in, we've got less than 10 minutes to move the money, Chloe said softly, but clear as day. Relax, she's out cold, my mother replied, her feet shifting like she was looking for the best angle to operate. I stayed perfectly still, my hand beneath the thin throw blanket gripping a second, palm-sized recorder, a backup in case they discovered my phone was running something unusual. The clock, tick-tock, tick-tock, felt impossibly slow, as if trying to give me more time. Damn it, Chloe muttered when her third attempt was blocked. Forget it, my father said, irritation creeping into his tone. We'll find another way. I heard my mother exhale sharply, then the sound of her moving something away. In my head, every detail was falling into place like perfectly cut puzzle pieces. The proof of their scheme. The voices of each one of them. The exact time anchored by the ticking clock in the background. They thought I was an unconscious prey, but in reality, I was watching them from inside the trap I had set. The warmth of my coat wrapped around me, the steady beat of my own heart syncing with that measured tick-tock, I felt as though everything had slowed down, every move they made already mapped out in my mind. Just a few more minutes, and the game would move to the next round. And this time, the cards would not be in their hands. I stayed still on the sofa, my breathing slow, my heartbeat blending with the tick-tock of the wall clock. Beneath the thin blanket, my fingers pressed lightly on the mini recorder, feeling each faint vibration as it continued to swallow every sound around me. Dad was the first to break the silence. If tonight goes as planned, tomorrow we call the lawyer right away. Transfer all her shares into our names before she even realizes what's happening. His voice was lowered, but not enough to drown out the steady ticking. Each word hit my ears like a knife pressed into wood. Chloe let out a dry laugh, the kind that savors victory before the game is even over. Told you, no one's so smart they never slip up. She really thinks two-factor authentication makes her untouchable? Those company shares, consider them an early Christmas gift. Mom cut in, her voice sweet in the most artificial way. Split it evenly, but my share will be bigger. After all, this was my idea. You and your dad just have to execute it, Chloe. I allowed the corner of my lips to twitch upward, still feigning sleep. Every word they spoke was arranging itself neatly into evidence, clearer than any accusation I could ever make. Dad replied, smugness dripping from his tone. I don't mind at all. She's looked down on us for years, now it's time to teach her a lesson. She'll be left with nothing but a pile of worthless papers. Chloe sat in the chair opposite me, waving her hand as if sketching out the picture of a future she was already savoring. I'll sell her shares right away. Use the money for a new apartment, and the rest, we split. There was a brief silence, then Mom's voice cut through, slow and deliberate. Tonight, it all ends. That sentence fell over the room like a period at the end of a sentence. But to me, it opened a whole new chapter. I cracked my eyes open, not enough to be caught, but enough to see the three of them leaning toward each other, the yellow light casting distorted shadows across their faces. My gaze was cold as glass, reflecting no warmth. Sliding my hand into my coat pocket, I unlocked my phone with a fingerprint scan, quickly moving the temporary recording file into a hidden folder and labeling it, Family Meeting. A copy simultaneously uploaded to my secure cloud storage. In my head, one sentence rang out, don't let emotions burn the plan. The warmth of the blanket, the lingering taste of cranberry on my lips, the tick-tock of the clock, all formed the perfect cover for the storm raging inside me. I had heard enough. Enough to know they were willing to cross any line. Enough to know I would never go back to being the Sam who endured in silence. Chloe stood, picked up my phone again, and tried to unlock it one more time. Failed. Frustrated, she tossed it back onto the table, the screen striking the wood with a sharp clack. I caught it from the corner of my eye, a small detail, but one that would sit neatly in the police report as proof they'd attempted to take my device. Tomorrow, I'll contact the buyer, Dad said. Just tell them the shares were transferred legally. Once we get the money, that's it. What if she wakes up early? Chloe asked, a trace of hesitation in her voice. Mom chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that sent a chill crawling down my spine. Then we'll just say, she dreamed it. I wanted to spring up, to shout in their faces that I never dream of things like this. But instead, I lay still, my hand gripping the recorder so tightly I could feel the metal edge pressing into my skin. Every word they uttered was a gift they were handing me, the very weapon to destroy their own scheme. Chairs scraped, footsteps moved away. They went into the kitchen, pots and pans clinking faintly. I opened my eyes fully, sitting up slowly, keeping the blanket draped loosely over my shoulders to muffle any sound. I switched off the recording mode on the backup device, quickly checked the main file on my phone. It was intact, over 20 minutes long. Listening to just the first few seconds was enough to confirm it. Each voice was crystal clear, unmistakable. I saved the file, locked my phone, and placed everything back exactly where it had been. Sitting still on the sofa, I looked out the window. The night sky was thick black, the yellow streetlight threading through bare winter branches. The air outside was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. In the dark reflection on the glass, I saw the image of a woman who was no longer passive. I held the strongest card in the deck, and I intended to play it to the very end. Mom's footsteps from the kitchen pulled me back to the present. I eased down again, closed my eyes, letting them go on believing I was still asleep. Outside, the clock kept ticking. And I knew, in just a few hours, everything would change. The next morning, as the pale winter light filtered through the curtains, I was ready. My phone, with the securely protected recording file, rested in the pocket of my coat, along with a backup copy on a tiny USB drive I clutched tightly in my hand. The air was cold, my breath turning into faint clouds with every brisk step along the sidewalk, but my heart burned as if I had swallowed a flame. The police station was only a few blocks away. The smell of coffee from the small shop next door drifted into each breath, but I didn't stop. When I pushed the door open, the scent of paper, ink, and the warmth from the heater washed over me, creating a sense of safety laced with urgency. The officer at the front desk looked up, his gaze both curious and serious. "How can I help you?" I placed the USB on the counter, my voice calm but firm. "I want to submit evidence for a fraud and asset appropriation case. It involves my family." He gestured for me to follow him into a private room. The door closed behind us, shutting out the noise of the waiting area. I recounted the entire incident, every detail from the night before, my hand still gripping my coat pocket as if afraid someone might snatch away the evidence. When the officer plugged the USB into the computer, the file opened with the familiar sounds of last night, sending a small shiver through me. My mother's voice, Chloe's voice, the ticking of the clock, all filled the small room. The officer's expression shifted noticeably, from neutral to sharply attentive. He nodded, jotting down notes continuously. "You'll need a witness to strengthen your case. Is there anyone willing to testify?" The first name that flashed in my mind, Lucas. We arranged to meet at a cafe near the bus station. When Lucas walked in, his dark coat dusted with a thin layer of frost, I could see in his eyes the kind of tension that comes from long familiarity. I told him what I had done, then set my phone on the table and played him a short segment of the recording. Lucas stayed silent for a long moment, then took a deep breath. "You have no idea. I was also a victim of theirs. Chloe borrowed money from me, promised to repay it in 3 months, but then disappeared. When I found her, I learned she had plotted with your family to erase the debt by pinning the blame on me." I sat still for a few seconds before asking, "So, will you testify?" Lucas looked at me, his eyes weighing something enormous. Then he nodded and extended his hand. I gripped it firmly, feeling the icy chill of his skin but also the certainty in his grasp. "You're not just saving yourself, you're saving me too." That sentence caught in my throat. For days I had been maneuvering alone, thinking I was fighting solely for myself. But now I realized justice was never about one person, it was the strength of people willing to stand together. We went back to the police station together. Lucas signed the witness statement, recounting the entire story he had lived through. The officer asked additional questions, and everything was documented carefully. But one more piece was missing, and it came from someone I least expected, Mrs. Callahan, the elderly neighbor who always observed everything from her window. When I knocked on her door, she opened it slightly, her blue eyes showing a trace of caution. I told her everything, holding nothing back. She stayed silent for a moment, then said, "Last night I saw Linda holding a bottle of sleeping pills, standing right near the kitchen. I wondered why she had it. If the police need my statement, I'll tell the truth." The door opened wider, and she handed me a cup of hot tea, the gentle scent of chamomile wrapping around me. In that moment, I understood that sometimes allies aren't the ones you seek out, but the ones who have quietly been watching and are ready when the moment comes. That afternoon, after all the statements and evidence had been submitted, Lucas and I stood on the steps outside the station. The air was so cold our breath turned to white vapor, but inside, I felt warmer than ever. We shook hands once more, and I knew, in this fight, I was no longer alone. Do you believe that justice always needs those who dare to stand up? And then justice came, and it was anything but gentle. As expected, only 2 days after all the evidence and witness statements were submitted, a court summons was delivered straight into my parents' hands. The mailman waited on the porch, holding a large sealed yellow envelope. When my mother opened it, I was told her hands shook so much the papers rattled against each other. My father stood beside her, scanning a few lines before gripping the strap of his coat, lips pressed tight, the reaction of someone who couldn't believe things had gone this far. They had always believed I would never dare to bring this into the light. That family was an unbreakable shield. But that shield, now, was nothing more than a thin layer of paper easily torn when what lay beneath had rotted through. The trial was set for the same week, so quickly they didn't have time to scramble for a reasonable story to defend themselves. I walked into the courtroom with Lucas and Mrs. Callahan. The smell of old varnished wood, the cold white light from the high ceiling, and the rhythmic tapping of the clerk's pen blended into a tense kind of soundtrack. They sat across the room in the defendant's seats. Chloe avoided my gaze, while my parents wore their familiar composed faces, the same expressions that had fooled neighbors, relatives, and even me for so many years. But this time, in front of the judge, no polite smile could hide the truth. The prosecutor played the audio file. My mother's voice, Chloe's voice, the ticking clock, and that line, "Tonight, everything ends," echoed through the room. I saw my mother's shoulder twitch when she heard her own words. Chloe pressed her lips together, but I caught the fleeting moment her eyes darted to my father, as if searching for a signal to save her. Lucas took the stand. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed firm, recounting how he had been used to cover Chloe's debt. Mrs. Callahan followed, calmly describing how she had seen my mother holding a bottle of sleeping pills right before that dinner. Each testimony was like another brick laid in the wall sealing off their escape. The sentence was handed down by the end of the day: probation, full restitution of the stolen money, loss of employment, and 6 months of community service. No one objected. There were no justifications, no defiant glares left. Only the sound of papers shuffling and pens signing the record, like cold final periods at the end of a long chapter. I didn't smile. Not because I wasn't satisfied, but because joy like this doesn't need a smile. It's more like closing the last door of an old house, knowing you'll never step inside again. As they were let out, I caught Chloe's eyes. No arrogance remained, only the late realization that a game can end over a single card they never saw coming. That afternoon, I sat in a quiet corner cafe. On the table before me, a steaming mug of hot cranberry, its deep red like a memory I'd never forget. This time, no one was forcing me to drink it. No hand slipped anything inside. I lifted the mug, letting the warmth spread from my fingertips into my palms, and took a deep breath. The tartness touched my tongue, but it carried no suspicion, only the pure taste of freedom. Outside the window, people passed by in calm, unhurried rhythms. No one knew, and no one needed to know, the silent battles that had been fought. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly but leaves deep cuts, forcing people to change. I ran my fingers along the rim of the mug, the chill of the glass mingling with the heat within. In that moment, I realized there are things that, once lost, leave you lighter. I no longer thought about them. Not about the sleepless nights, the knowing smiles. I thought about the road ahead, about new relationships to build, about mornings that would begin without the shadow of someone lurking behind. Do you believe that sometimes, letting go is the real victory? And I understood, trust has to be built. I sat at the table by the window, my leather notebook already open. The page was still blank, but in my mind, the words were already lined up, waiting to be written. I picked up my pen, took a deep breath, and wrote, "Trust is earned, not owed." The letters slanted slightly, the ink bleeding just a little at the corner of the T, as if the words themselves were breathing. The morning light poured through the glass, laying a thin golden sheet across the table. Outside, the street was slowly coming to life. The sound of tires pressing against the road, the fleeting laughter of someone stepping out of the cafe next door, and the scent of freshly roasted coffee drifting with the breeze. I took a sip of the cranberry drink still left in my cup, the warmth slipping down into my stomach like a reminder that everything had changed. I tilted my head slightly, letting the sunlight fall across the page. The next words came steadily, without rush, without pause. I owe no one, except myself, my peace. As soon as I finished writing, I stopped and set the pen down. For so long, I had given away trust as if it were a debt I was obligated to pay. But now, things were different. Trust was not a right someone automatically deserved just because they existed in your life. It was a gift, and it should only be given when the person receiving it knows how to cherish it. I lingered for a few more minutes, just to take in the moment. No more whispers behind my back. No more eyes peering over my shoulder. Only the steady beat of my own heart blending with the sounds of the morning. I touched the rim of my cranberry glass, letting the steam curl gently against my fingertips, then gathered my things into my bag. When I stood, I took one last look around the cafe. This place had witnessed me rewrite the most important truths, not for them, but for myself. The wooden door creaked softly as I pushed it open. A rush of crisp air swept in, carrying with it the brilliant light of a new morning. Stepping down onto the sidewalk, I felt my shoulders lighten. Each step seemed to erase another mark left by the past. On the pavement, a little girl was holding her mother's hand, running ahead, her laughter ringing out like wind chimes. I smiled, not because my story had ended, but because I knew I had stepped into an entirely new chapter. You might be in the middle of your own battle. Remember, you are not alone. Many out there have walked the same rocky path, and they've found the light, too. If this story speaks to you, share your experience in the comments. I read them all, and I believe connection can appear in the most unexpected places. And if you want to keep walking alongside me through stories of inner strength, the journey of finding yourself again, or endings that aren't sweet but are worth it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Not so I can count you as another number, but so that when you need a story, it will find you right on time. I pulled my collar up against the chill and stepped into the street. The cafe door closed softly behind me, but the light came with me. I knew that both freedom and trust are things we have to build for ourselves.